I know you're all fascinated by mysteries like me. It's something that really drives me. I'm somebody who's just obsessed with mysteries. As soon as I hear a mystery, I try to figure it out and figure out what it means. As a child, I really became intrigued by one particular mystery. And I mean, as a small child, I had a mother who was interested in this type of mysteries as well. And she introduced me to something that I believe today to be the greatest archaeological mystery of our time. I really believe that this is the greatest archaeological mystery. And I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but I just want to go over it fairly quickly. Let's see if this thing is going to work. No. Is that the button? No. Okay, no, that's not it. Yeah, but that wasn't the next slide. Let's see here. Maybe if I touch that one. Okay, yeah, boom, got it. This thing doesn't work. All right. I call it the greatest archaeological mystery of our time. It started in the 1800s when the Victorian era archaeologists began uncovering something strange in the ruins of the New World civilizations they were digging up. They noticed that cultures like the Maya and Aztecs in Mexico and the Inca and pre-Inca cultures of Peru, of which there are numerous, shared profound parallels. The parallels were with the cultures like the Egyptians in the Old World and the Babylonians and Persians in the Old World. They noticed that they had the same art, the same architecture, the same symbolism, the same iconography. And so, for example, ancient cultures, as we know across the world, didn't just build pyramids, they built stepped pyramids, and a lot of the times they built pyramids without a top. They're called truncated pyramids. And beside that, they realized that all around the world there was mummification, both in the Old World and New World, the two hemispheres across the Atlantic. Not only that, but they noticed that the mummies were given gold masks on their faces, and that's an interesting detail that was also the same. Instead of alphabets, they wrote in strange pictures that were called hieroglyphs. They're called hieroglyphs in the New World and the Old World as well. And they also used the same corbel vault arches. They're called corbelled vault arches. And they used these in their temples. And so exactly what meaning it had, they weren't sure, but they believed that there was something special there. There's a lot more parallels, but just to throw one more at you, and I know you've seen this one before, they all had the same elongated skull tradition. So the Victorian era archaeologists wondered, how is this possible across the Atlantic Ocean thousands of years before Columbus? And so they theorized that there must have been a mother culture, a parent source back to which these parallels can be traced. And they called it sort of an advanced civilization, and they believed it was so old that it had been forgotten by history. They identified this mother culture with the legendary Atlantis, and the Greeks talked about how the Atlantis existed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. As the story goes, the continent or the city of Atlantis fell beneath the waves, but survivors fled, forming new civilizations on both sides of the oceans. For many Victorians, this theory of Atlantis that sank beneath the sea and survivors fled to both parts of the world neatly explained the parallels that they were finding. So when I was around college age, this really started to sink into me, and I felt like this was a great and interesting topic to pursue for a few years. I was actually interested in Egyptology, and I wanted to pursue a career in Egyptology. So I started asking my professors and asking archaeologists and attending lectures and conferences. But I learned something very important. They all frowned on what I was interested in. They didn't really care about any of the parallels. They were almost upset when I would bring them up at a conference, and whatever I seemed to mention it, everybody kind of looked at me like, go away. And that kind of made me feel like I had to do something because I truly believed there was something there. And so I figured, maybe it's that we haven't really found the kind of smoking gun. Maybe we haven't found enough evidence to show what I believe was a probable connection between this old world and this new world. So the year was 1995. I was 23 years old. I was just graduating from college, and I decided to travel. And so I got a job, and I saved some money, and I went to different parts of the world, and I went to really good places. And one of the places I went to was Egypt, and I'd stayed for quite a while. This photo is really special for me because it reminds me of a great time in my life when I was discovering a lot of different things and realizing who I was as a person. And so while I was away, I spoke with scholars, I spoke with Egyptologists, museum curators, people at the archeological sites, people who grew up around there, guides at the sites. And within a few years, I started to recognize new parallels that the past Victorian scholars hadn't recognized before. And I started to recognize one parallel in particular that really just grabbed me. It just grabbed a hold of me like nothing else in my life. And you can see it here. I found an architectural parallel common to every single ancient culture. And I started to call it a Triptych Temple. Triptych is a word that was used by the Renaissance artists in order to explain a certain type of painting where the middle piece of the painting is larger than the two smaller pieces of the painting on either side. Now, notice here in these images how the door in the middle is slightly larger than the two doors flanking it on either side. I first noticed these triptych temples among the pyramid building civilizations, which, as we know, are the world's oldest cultures. But triptych temples are visible in the ruins of practically every ancient culture. And the thing that really got me was when I started to show people this, they said, well, that's just a coincidence. And I said, no, because I've really looked into this and I noticed that they occur multiple times in each culture. And here's an example. This is a collage of triptych temples that I found built by the ancient Maya culture of Mexico. And as you can see, it's not just one, it's several of them. And this is just a small handful. I could put probably about 30 or 40 more triptych temples built by the Maya that I know about on the screen. So I started to really realize that something big was behind this 3-in-1 door temple or 3-door temple. I intensified my study of ancient religions and spiritual traditions, and I started to realize that the triptych is not just a random visual similarity. Ancient peoples everywhere built the same triptych temples to symbolize and to celebrate the same, what I started to call, universal religion. I began to call this teaching, this universal religion, as a kind of perennial philosophy or as a kind of a wisdom tradition. And slowly I started to understand the universal religion. It's a self-empowering spiritual doctrine. And as we'll see today, it's based on the number 3, matching up to the 3 doors of the triptych. In a nutshell, just a quick idea here, the universal religion of the Triptych Temple teaches what in Latin is called the coincidentia oppositorum, and that means the union of opposites, or harmony of opposites. This idea, I would start to realize, forms the foundation of every ancient civilization, bar none. On the left, describing the Maya religion, I don't know if you could see from back there, but the Mesoamerican scholar Mercedes de la Garza wrote, the basic concept of the Mayan religion is that, and that of Mesoamerica in general, is the harmony of opposites. That's a profound statement. He's labeling what I found as the triptych as the actual basis of all of Mesoamerican and Mayan religion. In the middle, describing the Egyptian worldview, the Dutch Egyptologist Henri Frankfurt said the same thing. He said, the deeply rooted Egyptian tendency to understand the world is as a series of pairs of contrasts balanced in unchanging equilibrium. That's the same thing. It's the same exact concept, the balance of the opposites. And on the right, regarding Asia, the Hindu scholar Stephen Rosen said, the ability to see the harmony is nowhere more prominent than in Indian theology. Transcending of all pairs of opposites is central to Hindu thought. Central. That means there's nothing really more important than that. So this evidence shows that civilizations in ancient Africa, Asia, and America were linked by the very same balance of opposites idea, religion, concept, whatever you want to call it. So I really felt like I had something at this point. When I returned to New York City from my travels, I was still in my 20s, and I started to see triptych temples everywhere, but not in the ruins of ancient cultures. Now I was seeing them in more modern buildings, not in 1,000-year-old buildings, but in 100-year-old buildings. So I started to wonder, are these modern triptychs in some way memorials to the ancient Triptych Temple that I'd found? And I began to suspect that I wasn't the only person in the modern era to understand what the Triptych Temple was, or to discover the Triptych Temple phenomenon, or the universal religion that it symbolizes. I couldn't, though, find any books on it. I spoke to professors, archaeologists, historians, and nobody had heard of it, and nobody could tell me where I could find more information. So I continued looking for the triptych in architecture, and then one day I was in Manhattan in New York City. I was standing in front of Rockefeller Center, which I think you're all familiar with, and I kind of had an aha moment in my life. I noticed that the building's facade had a massive triptych entrance. Its twin outer doors are decorated with male and female figures, while the center door depicts an ancient god or deity. Now think about this: a male on the right, a female on the left, and a god in the middle. This matched my research. I was starting to realize that the twin outer doors of the triptych symbolize the doors of opposites, and the center door symbolizes the unity of the two doors in balance. You know, when they say center yourself, you're off center, you're on one side. Don't go to one side, don't go to the other. Stay balanced in the center. And that's where I started to feel like this was all about. So if you look closely now at the god in the triptych center door, he's holding a compass. He's holding a gold compass. I didn't know it then, but in time I learned that the compass is one of the chief symbols of an age-old fraternity of builders. It's called the Masonic fraternity. I learned that the Freemasons have a history reputed to stem from antiquity, that the Brotherhood is not really a religious group, but more of a mystical order. I learned that Freemasonry contains allusions to a variety of ancient civilizations, not just one culture, but many different cultures. And in my mind, I thought, wow, that's a perfect storehouse for an ancient universal religion. I also learned that many famous men were Freemasons. But what struck me probably as the most important thing was that I realized that Freemasonry holds some sort of strange fascination with the number 3. And there's the Masonic square and compass. It's very similar to the gold compass that's being held by the deity in the center door of the triptych. And here with the number 3, we read in Masonic author Jeremiah Howe's book, in Freemasonry, the number 3 is the most important and universal in its application of all the mystic numbers, and we find it pervading our whole ritual. On top of this, I discovered that US government buildings convey triptych architecture, including, but not limited to, the US Capitol building in Washington, D.C., which is arguably the most important building in the United States. As Freemasonry came to America from England, I found many British examples of the triptych also. Again, you could see we have the center door being a little bit, the triangle in the center is a little bit bigger than the two twin triangles flanking it. So I started to realize that there was something important that Freemasonry had to do with the triptych. And I became fascinated by secret societies in general. The Freemasons, the Skull and Bones, the Shriners, the Odd Fellows, the Knights of Pythias, and others. And I soon realized that the triptych is a common denominator that all of the secret societies share. It indicates to me that they were founded for a common purpose, namely to safeguard the universal religion of antiquity and to teach it to new initiates. And just to give you a quick preview here of some of the triptychs that I found, here are some Masonic lodges with a triptych on the facade. And as you can see, it's a purposeful triptych. It's a symbolic triptych. It didn't have to be there. It was put there purposely for a reason. Here are some Knights of Pythias lodges, the Knights of Pythias being a secret society as well, like the Freemasons. Here are some Knights of Pythias lodges with a triptych facades. And again, the same thing. It seems as though the triptych was put there on purpose for a reason to symbolize something. Here are some Shriner buildings with triptych facades. The Shriners were a spin-off organization of the Freemasons. And here are some Oddfellows lodges. Again, the Oddfellows, another secret society. Oddfellows lodges with triptych facades. And I don't know if you've heard of the Skull and Bones Secret Society at Yale University, but boom, right there. There's a triptych on the facade of the Skull and Bones headquarters at Yale University up in New Haven, Connecticut. No scholar has, like I said before, has ever noticed this triptych repetition. There's been no books about it, no lectures, no papers. But here's something interesting. Some artists have unconsciously picked up on it. Now, I don't know, do you guys have The Simpsons here? You do, right? Or no, I don't know. It's been a crazy few days and I haven't forgot to ask somebody, but Matt Groening is the creator of The Simpsons, and in one episode, the fictional stonecutters are a parody of the Freemasons. And if you look at Groening's triptych, it forms the headquarters here. As you can see, the center door is wider and taller than the two doors flanking it. Notice there's a giant eye in the middle door of the triptych. We're going to talk about that in a bit. But a lot of Masonic lodges also have that same exact pattern, that same triptych, even made with triangles. And the eye in the center is prominent. The way, as you can see here, it's a little hard to see, but if you look closely, there's a giant eye inside that triangle. So when I was a kid, again, another one, what about the Flintstones? Did you guys have the Flintstones? Yeah, the Loyal Order of Dinosaurs, you know, Triptych Secret Society and the Flintstones. And the reason I think people was, oh, you know, they knew, everybody knew. I don't know about that. I think maybe as an artist, the artist was tasked with drawing a secret society, and he probably looked at some buildings of secret societies, and as an artist, he probably recognized the pattern, didn't think much of it, but included it here. So I was really enthralled by all this. I really felt like I was onto something very important. So I went down to, I grew up in New York City, and I went down to visit the 23rd Street Masonic Temple. I expected to find these master occultists, master esoteric teachers, but instead, to my great surprise and to my great dismay, I learned that most Masons had very little interest in esoteric subjects. I soon realized that for the past 150 years, Freemasonry has been suffering from a kind of amnesia. The true wisdom of the fraternity seems to have disappeared from the consciousness of its members. In their book, The Hiram Key, Freemasons Chris Knight and Robert Lomas say, a compelling reason for silence among Masons is not so much a fear of macabre retribution. It's more that they don't understand a word of the ceremonies they participate in. Our biggest criticism of Freemasonry is its sheer pointlessness. It doesn't know where it came from, and no one knows what it's trying to achieve. According to the website of the Grand Lodge of England, the honest answer to the questions when, where, and why Freemasonry originated are that we simply don't know. And so this is a challenge. Why don't the Freemasons understand their own origins? So this gave me kind of a newfound enthusiasm. One thing very quickly is that I learned from the Grand Lodge of England. I spoke to them and they said, the only thing that we can tell you is that we believe that Freemasonry has arisen from the cathedral builders of medieval times. And so that really sparked my interest. And I kind of, with newfound enthusiasm, I went to Europe and I started to study the cathedrals, and right away I noticed that they were all packed with incredible symbolism, and symbolism that not necessarily Christian. I found that different symbols that we call pagan were written in stone upon them. But I started to notice something really important, and this is what really changed my life at this point. I started to notice a repeating architectural pattern, the same pattern over and over again on different cathedrals. And scholars have not recognized this pattern. I asked many, probably over 100 of them, and nobody had heard of anything, could never point me into a book that showed me this pattern. And so I described this pattern in my 2011 book, Written in Stone, where I refer to it as the Cathedral Code. It's formed by the following 3 architectural features. First, 2 tall twin towers on top. Second, a giant rose window in the center. And third, a triptych 3-door entrance on the bottom. And this same pattern repeats on literally hundreds and perhaps even thousands of Gothic cathedral facades in Europe. So why do we have the same repeating pattern? Why? Is it possible that there's a message encoded in this design? Is it possible? So I was traveling from cathedral to cathedral trying to figure it out. During my trip, I took a book, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, written by Victor Hugo, 1829. And in it, Hugo called architecture the handwriting of the human race. He also said something even more telling. He said, excuse me, from remotest antiquity, the human race has employed architecture as its chief means of writing. Sometimes an entrance, a front, or even an entire church presents a symbolic meaning wholly foreign to religion or even hostile to the church. Only the initiated can decipher these mysterious books. I was also reading a book called The Beautiful Necessity, written in 1910 by an American author named Claude Bragdon. He wrote, in medieval Europe, fragments of the secret doctrine transmitted in the symbols and secrets of the cathedral builders determined much of Gothic architecture. In his 1989 book, The Occult Conspiracy, author Michael Howard agreed with this, saying, it's generally believed in occult circles that these medieval Masons had inherited esoteric knowledge from their pagan antecedents, and that this knowledge was incorporated into the sacred architecture of the cathedrals. So I slowly became convinced, as I was looking at these Gothic cathedrals, that in fact, what they really are triptych temples, or something akin to it. I also began to think that the entire Gothic cathedral facade surrounding the triptych, including the twin towers and the rose window, is a message in stone that reveals the triptych's true meaning. Of course, this would be heresy, and this would be considered a direct threat by the church. And so I started to learn that at some point in the 1700s, the church suddenly and inexplicably broke away from the Freemasons. The church did a 360-degree about-face, and instead of commissioning the Freemasons to build more cathedrals, they suddenly sought to stomp out and destroy Freemasonry forever. In the 1700s, Pope Leo XIII accused the Masons of practicing paganism. Imagine that. You had these builders of your churches for centuries, and then all of a sudden something happens and you accuse them of being pagans. He wrote, the purpose and aim of the Masonic sect, having been discovered from plain evidence, is easy to understand. To try to revive, after 18 centuries, the manners and institutions of paganism. We intend to turn our attention to the Masonic fraternity to illustrate more and more this wicked force and stop the spread of this contagious disease. Wow, that's big. Something big happened. What did they find? So we can find the answers to what they found, I believe, by decoding the Gothic cathedral architecture. And in order to do that, we need a key, and I think I found the key. The key is what's called a tracing board. And it's present in every Masonic lodge around the world. The tracing board, in my opinion, is a blueprint of the Gothic cathedral facade. It's a blueprint of the cathedral code. It might not look like a blueprint to you, but that's exactly what it is. Look at the twin pillars on the tracing board. Masons call these the Jachin and Boaz pillars. These are the cathedral's twin towers, I believe. Writing in the early 1900s, other authors believed it as well, including Masonic author Walter Wilmshurst, who wrote, "The twin pillars have been incorporated into Christian architecture. If you recall the construction of York Minster or Westminster Abbey, you'll recognize the pillars in the two great towers flanking the main entrance." Is this true? Are the twin pillars called by Freemasons Jachin and Boaz really encoded into all the twin pillars of cathedral architecture? If so, why? What exactly do the Jachin and Boaz pillars symbolize? Masons are told that they symbolize that they once decorated the front entrance to King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, but I believe that this is just a dead-end story. It doesn't lead anywhere. It doesn't teach you anything. In truth, the Masonic twin pillars form what I believe are the very foundations of the ancient universal religion that I talked about. How? Well, look at the tracing board. Notice how the pillar on the right-hand side, which is called Jachin, is capped by the sun. And the left-hand pillar on the left side, obviously called Boaz, is capped by the moon. This duality of the sun and moon tell us something critically important. All the world's cultures perceive the sun and moon as perfect opposites, as I'm sure many of you know. In every culture, a swastika symbol was used to symbolize this idea. Every culture, same concept. A swastika has two S's. One S is a symbol of the sun, and the other S is a symbol of the moon. The sun and moon are perfect opposites according to a law in nature that we can all understand. The sun rules the day, the moon rules the night. The day brings light, the night brings dark. The light brings hot, the dark brings cold. The hot brings dry, the cold brings moist. The day symbolizes life, the night symbolizes death. Life is embraced as good, but death is feared as evil. Now, this is a naturally occurring pairs of opposites that are happening here. And by this chain of associations, the sun and moon engender and denote all the pairs of opposites in our world, in our universe. Now, here's something interesting. The sun and moon shine on average 12 hours out of 24 each, daily. That's half each. That's exactly half each, right? And here's something that honestly, it changed my life, this next little bit of information. When viewed from Earth, the sun and full moon appear to be identically sized in our sky, as if these twin heavenly bodies are perfect opposites. The sun is much bigger, obviously, but the moon is much closer. So when viewed from Earth, they're the exact same size. So if you put this all together, this is not a marvelous coincidence, the way astronomers say, but really what it is, it's evidence of the mystical nature, in my opinion, the mystical nature of human existence. Ancient Chinese philosophers knew this well. Their Taijitu symbol, which we call the yin-yang, depicts the sun and full moon together in one circle. The yin, or full moon, covers half the circle. The yang, or sun, covers the other half. And now think of this in terms of the tracing board. The sun crowns the Jachin pillar, that's yang. The moon crowns the Boaz pillar, that's yin. Thus, the Jachin and Boaz pillars of Freemasonry, like the yin-yang symbol, stand for the doctrine of duality, the pairs of opposites. And this is something that Wilmshurst, the author I quoted before, also knew. He said, many centuries before our Bible was written, the two pillars were used in temples. They stand for what is known as the pairs of opposites. Everything in nature is dual and can only be known in contrast with its opposite. And here's a quote from an interesting author named Warren Kenton, whose work is often cited by Prince Charles. He said, erected by the Masons, the west front of each church had two towers representing the twin columns, the masculine and feminine aspects, flowing down from heaven, called in Chartres Cathedral the sun and moon towers. Now this is interesting because here, Kenton points out something that's a little bit more tangible for us to look at. We have the two towers on Chartres Cathedral. The right-hand tower is capped by an image of the sun, and the left-hand by an image of the moon. And this is referring to what Kenton calls, quote, the masculine and feminine aspects. That's because man and woman, like every other pair of opposite, is encapsulated by this doctrine. We're told by the early 20th century author Claude Bragdon, man, like the sun, is lord of the day. Woman is subject to the lunar rhythm. The Masonic guilds of the Middle Ages were custodians of the esoteric. The north or right-hand tower, the man's side, was called the sacred male pillar, Jachin. And the south or left-hand tower, the woman's side, the sacred female pillar, Boaz. And we see this on the Grand Master Certificate of the 16th century heretic Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake in the year 1600 for heresy. We have a male pillar crowned by the sun on the right side facing us, and a female pillar crowned by the moon on the left side facing us. Again, this matches the twin towers of Gothic cathedrals. But why is the pair of opposites teaching so important? Why is it important that we have duality? What does it exactly mean? What does this wisdom mean to you and me? And the answer is, we live inside the universe, not separated from it. Thus, we too are formed by opposites. Our bodies are made from the same pairs of opposites as the universe, the light and the dark, the good and the evil, the right and the wrong, etc. Shakespeare said, our life is a mingled yarn, good and evil together. And the ancients believed this wholeheartedly. They believed the right side of our body was male and solar, and the left side was female and lunar. And again, Claude Bragdon says, though essentially a unit, there's a well-marked division into right and left. We have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 ears, 2 eyes. Moreover, the terms of such pairs are masculine and feminine with respect to each other, one being active and the other passive. So no human, of course, is completely one gender or the other. Despite our physical characteristics, we all possess both masculine and feminine. Manly Hall was a Masonic author, and he noticed this, and he said, in ancient times, men fought with their right arms, and they defended with their left arms. The right side of the body was considered masculine, and the left side feminine. So this portrait appeared in an esoteric manuscript in the 1400s. It's a 2-headed human, a male on the right holding the sun, and a female on the left holding the moon. This is an esoteric portrait of you. It reveals the true makeup of a human being, half male, half female. And this explains the angel on our right shoulder telling us to do good, and the demon on our left shoulder telling us to do evil. And that's something that we find in a lot of different cultures till today. There's good and evil in the world, and that means there's good and evil in all of us. Now, here's the question. Is that our fate? To be ruled by yin and yang, to be tossed about left and right, to be so off balance that we don't know who we are and we can't find our center? No. The answer that the ancient philosophers said was no. We can transcend this duality. How do we do that? Well, we do that according to the Freemasons and according to the people who preserved this ancient wisdom. We do that using the Masonic number 3. And remember I said before, 3 is the key number in Freemasonry. The Masonic 3 teaches that we're more than just the twin opposing halves of an animal body. These twin halves don't constitute the whole human being. Only the physical part, the material part, the part that lives and dies on earth. The Masonic 3 teaches that deep down there's a spiritual part. And this third part, this spiritual part, encompasses both sides of the duality. And it can be found only through the union of the twin opposing halves. And this is, again, what I said before, the Latin term coincidentia oppositorum, or the pairs of opposites, the balance point of the opposites, as I mentioned before. And I'll explain now how the ancients knew this. They knew it because you could see it in their symbols. Look at the Taijitu. You have yin and yang, and they represent the physical sides of the human body. But now look, yin and yang are both encapsulated inside of a giant circle. Okay, a lot of people miss that circle. They just see, oh, it's yin and yang. Yeah, but what about the third part? The most important part of this is the circle. The circle encompasses both yin and yang. And the circle symbolizes eternity because with no beginning and no end, a circle has always symbolized eternity to all ancient civilizations. The circle, according to Freemasons, is a symbol of your soul. It's called Tao in Chinese thought, and the circle is the part of you out of which all existence arises, and inside of which the pairs of opposites live and move and have their being. The ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu says, "He who follows the Tao is one with the Tao. Being at one with the Tao is eternal. Though the body dies, the Tao will never pass away." The yin-yang is in fact a three-part symbol, as I just was mentioning. It has three parts. It's made of twin dualities, yin and yang, with the circle being the third part, the Tao being the third part. And this is the higher unity that yin and yang are encompassed in. And Lao Tzu tells us that as well. He says, the Chinese Trinity, being the duality of yin and yang organized into a higher unity, is regarded as the source of all existence. And its symbol, the yin yang, possesses special significance for the Chinese thought, for the Chinese heart. And so this idea that a third force of unity ties together twin opposites is central in Freemasonry. We find it in Masonic thought and in Masonic architecture too. In Freemasonry, though, its symbol is not a circle like it is in Taoism, encompassing the yin-yang. In Freemasonry, its symbol is the triangle. The triangle that unites the twin pillars Jachin on one side and Boaz on the other. In precisely the same way, the circle unites yin and yang. And we could say that in another way. The triangle's apex transcends its two lower points, just as your soul transcends the two animal halves of your body. And this is because your soul is older than and higher than your body. Your soul is the source of your body. Think of the story of the Garden of Eden, the fall. We've fallen after eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We've fallen down into the lower world of duality. We've fallen from our higher spiritual home in the heavens, and we've landed in a world of opposites. And this concept is rampant in Masonic writers of the 19th and early 20th century, including John Yarker, who said, according to this mystic doctrine, all souls have pre-existence and have descended from the spiritual world into the earthly prison of the body. In other words, you're divine already. You existed before your body's birth, and you'll survive your body's death. You're more than just a physical body. You're a soul, and in authentic Freemasonry, and in these teachings, in this Hermetic wisdom, being a soul means being a god. A soul is a god. You are a god. A fallen god, but a god just the same. Having fallen, you are now, in a sense, imprisoned by the body, which mimics the duality of the universe which your body temporarily lives in. And the esoteric scholar Alvin Boyd Kuhn said that. He said, man is a god in the body of an animal, according to the pronouncement of ancient philosophy. He's absolutely right, because the ancient philosophers talked about this. They all did. You find the same concepts that you find in Greek philosophy, in Hinduism, you find it in Taoism, you find it in religions essentially all over the world. The famous 19th century essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's one of my favorites, said, a man is a god in ruins. And the famous 19th century French poet Alphonse de Lamartine said, limited in his nature, infinite in his desire, man is a fallen god who remembers heaven. I thought that was a profound quote when I first came across it. Man is fallen because, in a sense, your body is not your true home. It's an imperfect and transitory vehicle. It's taught in ancient philosophy that your body imprisons your soul, because think about it, your body has to be cared for. In order to survive, your body has to constantly breathe, eat, drink, maintain a constant temperature, fight disease. Even if your body can endure for decades, death will eventually destroy it. So for the ancients, your fall into a body was somewhat perceived as a tragedy. The 19th century author Olympus Gregory wrote, the Platonists in general believed in a pre-existent state in which all souls had sinned and lost their wings, and so they sank into these bodies, partly as a punishment for former follies. It means you've descended so deeply into the material world that you've lost sight of your God self, of your spiritual self. You're so enwrapped in matter that you have amnesia of who you really are. And that's the God within you. So the important part of the Masonic teachings that really touched me the most was that despite all this, you can use the number 3 to sort of take back who you really are, remember who you really are. And you do this by turning on the soul. You know that your soul is being covered over by your body, but if you balance the opposites, if you transcend the opposites, you can actually find that center between them. And that's the third force. That's the coincidentia oppositorum. And you find this in, again, all the traditions, and especially in the magical traditions. We're told by Israel Regardie, who was a student of the magician Aleister Crowley, only in the reconciliation of opposing forces is the pathway made to true occult knowledge and practical power. In other words, you have to join your right and left sides. You have to join your male and female halves, and you'll find what you're seeking. And this is what we're told in the aphorisms of Zosimos. When you join the opposites, a mystical awakening occurs. It involves our suddenly becoming aware of an organ and human faculty that we didn't know we really had. And we can see that hidden organ on this Masonic tracing board. It's very similar to the Masonic tracing board I showed you earlier. It depicts what seems to be an ancient pagan temple, and that's because it reveals an ancient pagan teaching. First, look at the twin pillars, Jachin and Boaz. They're aligned with the sun and moon directly above them. Now, look at the tops of the twin pillars. They both form the lower 2 halves of a triangle. Third, look at the apex of that triangle and notice the luminous eye directly above it. Why an eye? The answer is when you unite the opposites, you suddenly become illuminated, awakened. You suddenly become whole again. And when this happens, a mysterious hidden eye opens within you. Plato called it the eye of the soul, and the soul is who you really are. And we see this here in an old Masonic temple in Prague, Czechoslovakia. Many Freemasons believe incorrectly that this is the eye of the God of the Bible. But according to Plato, in every man there's an eye of the soul, which is far more precious than 10,000 bodily eyes, for by it alone is truth seen. The eye of the soul is naturally adapted to be resuscitated and excited by the mathematical discipline. Excuse me. Located in the center of our brains, Plato's eye of the soul has historically been called the divine's eye, the mind's eye, the cyclopean eye. And that's a whole nother lecture where we could talk about the cyclopean ruins. They're very advanced. They're very powerful. I think it has something to do with the third eye. The real name of it is the third eye. And the awakened third eye endows its possessor with higher consciousness. And curiously, the third eye is not even mentioned in Western medicine. Our history books carry a very small description of it. They call it the pineal gland. In Webster's dictionary, only has a couple of sentences devoted to it, calling it an appendage of the brain. It has the structure of an eye, and it's variously postulated to be a vestigial third eye, or even a seat of the soul. And there you have a remnant of the teaching. They're calling it a seat of the soul. Awakening the third eye is a custom in Asia to this day, in the Hindu religions, Buddhism. Here, the third eye is called Urna and Trinetra. It's marked by a dot on the forehead. It's called the Ajna chakra. It's one of the 7 chakras that are aligned in our spinal column, going from the pelvis to the top of the head. I'm sure you've all heard of them before. All the chakras are connected from the lowest to the highest through a central channel called the Sushumna. And 2 opposing channels, the Ida and Pingala, run to the left and right of the Sushumna. Negatively charged Ida is our left channel, that's the lunar and feminine channel. Positively charged Pingala is our right channel, that's our solar and masculine channel. And here you can see that the Ida and Pingala channels of Hinduism, of Kundalini Yoga, match up perfectly with the Jachin and Boaz columns and the yin and yang of Taoism. And so you're starting to see that they're all the same. It's teaching the same concepts everywhere. The art of Kundalini Yoga is personified on this ancient megalithic Hindu statue. It depicts a male on one side, a female on the other, both balanced in the middle by the god Shiva. And the awakened third eye is visible. The late Dr. Lee Sanella, who was the co-founder of the Kundalini Clinic in California, says that Kundalini is the real cause of all the so-called spiritual and psychic phenomena. The secret origin of all esoteric and occult doctrines, the master key to the unsolved mystery of creation, the inexhaustible source of philosophy, art, and science, and the fountainhead of all religious faiths, past, present, and future. And so during my studies, I came to believe that Kundalini Yoga, this awakening of the third eye by balancing the Jachin and Boaz, sun and moon, played a key role in the great work of all the secret societies, not just Freemasonry. And here are some images of what I believe is the awakened third eye on some Oddfellows regalia. The Masonic triangle thus denotes more than just balancing life's dualities. It stands for the awakened third eye that occurs when life's dualities are balanced. And I want to show you a cool quote from Carl Jung. He says, "Unfortunately, our Western mind, lacking all culture in this respect, has never yet devised a concept or even a name for the union of opposites through the middle path, that most fundamental item of inward experience. It's at once the most individual fact and the most universal, the most legitimate fulfillment of the meaning of an individual's life." 1918, Dr. George Washington Carey. "The all-seeing eye," this is the eye of Freemasonry, the third eye. "While incredibly formed that few Masons understand their own symbols, the fact remains that they use them." And let's return now to the Gothic cathedrals, and we'll be finishing the lecture right now with this. You can see if you follow the Twin Towers down, they end in what I call the doors of opposites. A third larger door is centered between the doors of opposites, and this third larger door unites the doors of opposites into a kind of 3-in-1 symbol. Just as the apex of a triangle unites its two lower halves, and just as the circle unites the twins yin and yang. So the triptych's center door thus signifies this center point, this balance of the two opposite sides between them. And therefore it represents the soul between us, the soul within us in our center, and the God within us. In this way, the entire triptych itself represents Carl Jung's union of opposites through the middle path. When we do this, when we unite the opposites, when we balance ourselves in our center, we awaken to a different path. We find our inner God, we find our inner peace. And I think that's what this triptych tradition says all around the world. I've only just given you a very small piece of what I've found because of the only 45-minute ability to tell you. I don't want to go into every ancient culture and show proof of that. I do that in my book. But the idea here is we find the inner God in the middle between us, this God symbol on Rockefeller Center triptych, when we do balance these opposites. Now, very quickly, if you follow the middle door upward, you see the rose window. And the rose window is circular. Okay, remember we said the circle is always a symbol of eternity and the eternal soul. It's a perfect symbol of the God within us and the soul within us between the twin towers of duality. And we have author Michael Rose who says in his book, Ugliest Sin, the rose window is a representation of perfection, balance, and the harmony of the purified soul. Got a great quote here from Prince Charles, who really has a lot of esoteric wisdom in him. And he says, the entrance into the building, he's talking about Chartres Cathedral, which I showed before. The entrance into the building is through a west front, which comprises 2 soaring towers, one with a symbol of the moon upon it, one bearing the symbol of the sun, and beneath them sits one of the most spectacular of all rose windows, symbolizing the uniting of the apparent duality, represented by the symbols of the sun and moon. When I read that, it was a kind of confirmation that I was reading these cathedrals correctly, and that really blew me away. The rose window is a descendant of Roman eye called the oculus. It actually stands for eye, what Plato called the eye of the soul, because the rose window is both a symbol of the eye and the soul. And it's depicted just above the center door of the triptych. It's aligned perfectly in the center between the twin opposites. So the last quote I'll show today is this one from the Hunchback of Notre Dame, where Victor Hugo likens that center rose window with the eye of a cyclops. He says there's a certain hour above all others when the facade of Notre Dame should be admired. It's the moment when the sun, already declining towards the west, looks the cathedral almost full in the face, its rays growing more strongly, while the central rose window flames like the eye of a cyclops. I think that's an esoteric reference right there. In the US, we have something called the Ku Klux Klan. That's Ku Klux, the word circle, the Circle Klan. That evolved into a racist organization, but originally it was an esoteric community. And if you think about a rose window, really what a rose window is, it's a circle with a dot in the center. And that we know in symbology is a symbol of the self. So tomorrow what I'll do is I'll present the conclusion of this lecture. And we'll see how an eye symbol is depicted above the triptych's center door. It's a common feature in Europe and in other parts of the world. It's not, unless somebody points it out to you, like I'm doing here, it's hard to see. But here you can see this is the Bank of France, and this building is from the late 1800s, I believe. It's a triptych, it's a 3-in-1 pattern, and there's a third awakened eye above the center door. And this is the whole concept of the triptych that we see in all the ancient civilizations. It means the same thing everywhere. Ida on one side, Pingala on the other, that's the Jacob and Boaz, the Sushumna in the middle with the awakened third eye to signify the higher self. This is a building in New York City that has the same 3-door triptych, 2-pillar Jacob and Boaz, and if you look at the light coming from the third eye above the top, you could see a parallel. So the information I presented here is just a small amount of the information I've gathered. There was a universal religion of antiquity. It was based on the balance of opposites. The main architectural symbol was the Triptych Temple, and it was encoded in architecture by the Freemasons, who I believe inherited this wisdom from their pagan antecedents. Okay, so in part 1, we talked about the Triptych Temples and how they were built by the pyramid cultures. And we saw how the same 3-in-1 door triptych was later inherited by secret societies like the Skull and Bones, Shriners, Masonic Fraternity, and the Knights of Pythias. I explained my theory that the Triptych Temples encode what we talk about in Latin as the coincidentia oppositorum, which is the balance of opposites. And how this was what I believe, what I call a universal religion in antiquity. So we saw how medieval operative cathedrals built by the Freemasons encode this 3-in-1 door triptych entrance. And finally, I talked about how the Gothic architecture surrounding the triptych in these cathedrals symbolizes the very same balance of opposites teaching that we see in the ancient cultures, thus revealing the meaning of the triptych. The architecture around the cathedrals reveals the same balance of opposites as the ancient Triptych Temples. So it's very clear to me, and the way I explain it in the book, that the Freemasons really understood the ancient meaning of the triptych, and not just in one ancient civilization, but in Asia, in Africa, and in the Americas, as we talked about yesterday. So today I want to start by pointing out some of the more esoteric triptych architecture that's hidden in famous artwork. And here's an example. Take a close look at the triptych 3-in-1 window behind Jesus in the famous Last Supper painting. Notice how it matches up with the image on the bottom. The image on the bottom shows a window from a Masonic temple. And as you can see, the triptych is the common denominator here. I found that fascinating because it shows a connection, really. And it shows how the triptych is at the center of this connection. Now, with 6 apostles on one side and 6 apostles on the other side of Christ, it's clear that Da Vinci really wanted to convey the idea of a balance, and again, you have the balance of opposites, 6 on one side and 6 on the other. And the message here is When you balance the twin sides, you find the center. And again, from yesterday, we talked about how the center was the God self, the inner spiritual soul self, the higher self. And that is a God, according to esoteric philosophy, Freemasonry, Hermeticism, and so on. This inner divinity, as we call it, is depicted by the Christ figure. And notice how he's aligned with the center door. Christ is aligned with the center door. In esoteric Christianity, this so-called Christ principle stands for the inner soul, the inner God. It's the eternal and divine part of us that was never born and never dies. The 20th century scholars like Gerald Massey and Alvin Boyd Kuhn discussed this idea of the Christ principle in their books, lectures, and research papers. They showed how Christianity is really based on a corruption of the pagan teachings regarding this idea. For the pagans, the Christ did not refer to one man. There was not one Christ over there. It denoted the inner soul or the inner God that we all have within us. And that's a very important teaching. Here we have a quote from Massey. Christ was the immortal spirit in man. It did not and could not depend on any single manifestation in one historic personality. Historic Christianity originated with turning the teachings inside out and externalizing the mythical allegory in a personal human history, a huge and hideous mistake. More recently, in his 2005 book, The Pagan Christ, Rhodes scholar Tom Harper resurrected Massey's teachings, and he said, the Christ principle is potentially in every one of us. Christ of the myth became a flesh and blood person identified with Jesus. And again, he points out how that's a mistake as well. And of course, we have Joseph Campbell, who in the late 19th and the 20th century talked about how we are all manifestations of Buddha consciousness or Christ consciousness, only we don't know it. The word Buddha means the one who waked up. We are all to do that. We're all to wake up to the Christ or Buddha consciousness within us. And as early as the 1800s, this is fascinating to me, the Freemasons knew all this, even before a lot of the modern scholars like Joseph Campbell. Here's a quote from a book in 1896 by a Freemason named J.D. Buck. Listen to what he says. When this perfection is realized, the state is called Christos with the Greeks and Buddha with the Hindus. It'll be urged by modern theologians that this view dethrones Christ. To this objection, the answer is that any other view orphans humanity. It's far more important that men should strive to become Christs than that they should believe that Jesus was Christ. If the Christ state can be attained by but one human during the whole evolution of the race, then the evolution of man is a farce and human perfection an impossibility. And here's my favorite part. Jesus is no less divine because all men may reach the same divine perfection. And we're at a conference called Megalithomania, and in my opinion, all the megalithic architecture in the ancient world is based on this information. I believe it's something that has to do with the power that we have within us to manifest this Christ state, this higher power within us, and the understanding of the way the sun and the moon work and the way the sun and the moon have a pull on us because we're all a part of the same universe, and how it all affects the ideas here being described. Finding the center between opposites, and again in the megalithic ruins, the opposites being the sun and the moon, finding the center is tantamount to finding the inner Christ. And this is the message of the Last Supper. It's also the message encoded in the triptych that we find esoterically encoded in the so-called Calvary scene or the Golgotha scene of the crucifixion of Christ. 3 crosses, right? And Christ's cross is in the middle. And it's flanked by 2 opposing crosses. Now, how do we know these are opposites? These crosses on either side of Christ are opposing crosses. We know this from Scripture because if you remember, there are 2 thieves who were crucified on both sides of Christ. There was the penitent thief on the right, the one who realized he had sinned, and then the impenitent thief on the left, the one who was not remorseful. Those are opposites. These thieves, in fact, represent the yin and the yang, the male and the female, the left and the right, the penitent and the impenitent. It's the pairs of opposites that we've been discussing. Christ in the middle forms the balance point, the center point between the two opposites, between the two extremes. Many Renaissance artists knew about this, and one of them was an Italian painter named Andrea Mantegna. Excuse me. Basically what he did was he painted one cross in the light, and he painted the other cross in the dark. One that he painted in the light is on the right side of Christ. That's the penitent thief. And the one in the dark he painted as the impenitent thief. Again, the coincidentia oppositorum, the balance of the opposites. Excuse me. So, as we can see by this side-by-side comparison, the triptych that Da Vinci used is actually rooted in ancient Egypt. Notice the similarity in architecture here. The Egyptians were prolific builders of ancient triptych temples. Here we see one image from Trajan's kiosk in Philae. And we can see that crowning the center door of the triptych temple is a symbol called the Aton. It's the sun disk of Egypt. Now, the Aton crowns the center door of all of Egypt's triptych temples, and it later became the rose window of Gothic cathedrals. And we talked about that in yesterday's lecture, how there's a rose window above the center door of all the Gothic cathedrals. And you can see the parallel here. See the three doors of the triptych with a rose window atop the center door, and the same thing here. Three doors of a triptych, and you have a circular symbol above the center door. In Egypt, the rose window is circular. The Aton is circular, just like in the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals. This is the Hathor Temple at Dendera, and it too is a triptych temple with the Aton symbol above the center door. This is another triptych temple in Egypt from Aswan, and again, note the triptych or sun disk, the Aton or sun disk crowning the center door. Here is another triptych from Egypt. This is from the Temple of Seti II in Karnak. And again, it's a perfect triptych temple. You can't see it, but there's an Aton or sun disk crowning the center door. So in every one of Egypt's triptych temples, the primary significance is given to the center door. And in every single case, there's always the Aton symbol above the center door. Now, why the Aton? Okay, what exactly does the Aton symbolize? So just like in the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals, the Aton is a circle with a dot in the center, and when it's written in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, for the Egyptians, the Aton symbolized both the third eye and the inner soul or source that the awakened third eye sees. And you can see that here in this imagery. Now remember how we talked about yesterday how the rose window is actually a symbol of the self, and it's also a symbol of the third eye. The third eye awakens and sees the inner self. It doesn't no longer see the yang side of things or the yin side of things. It's now balanced in the center. It can awaken its third eye, and the third eye looks inward. The eye is a center with a point in the middle because that's the shape of the soul. And we know this because the Aton appears on the forehead in Egyptian artifacts, and we can see that here. These Egyptian images depict what in ancient Hinduism is called the Ajna chakra, the third eye chakra. So the Aton was depicted as a third eye between the two eyes. It's the same exact thing that we see in India. You show this to an Egyptologist and he will just laugh at you. And I know that because I've done that and they've laughed. The Aton stands for the awakened third eye that sees the soul within, which soul we all have. It's the divine spark within us. The Aton is thus a symbol of both the third eye and the inner soul. So I explain a lot of this in my book, Written in Stone. I also explain it in my other book, The Missing Link. The circle has no beginning and no end, and therefore it symbolizes eternity. We talked about that yesterday. Now look at the twin serpents that are issuing from the Aton symbol. Of course, the Aton has wings, and we know that anything with wings is heavenly. It's higher because it's able to fly high. Anytime you have something with wings, you know it's something higher, spiritual, eternal, divine. So, but if you look at the two serpents, what exactly do the two serpents stand for? And they stand for yin and yang, and left and right, and good and evil, and all the pairs of opposites. Now, how do we know they symbolize this duality, this pairs of opposites teaching? Well, first of all, they're of equal size and parallel shape, and that's important. Second, the serpents are facing opposite directions, signifying their corresponding yet contrary natures. And most importantly, the twin serpents were often depicted wearing the so-called white and red crowns of Egypt. The white crown was worn by the king of Upper Egypt. The red crown was worn by the king of Lower Egypt. Now, to understand the duality here, we really need to understand something about the history and geography of Egypt. Probably the most amazing thing about Egypt is that the entire empire formed a magical balance of opposites. And this truth is hidden in the actual flow of the River Nile. From time immemorial, the Nile has divided Egypt into a duality of two lands. The actual Nile has divided Egypt into two lands, so-called Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. From Upper Egypt in the country's south, that's the lower part, from Upper Egypt in the country's south, the Nile flows downstream towards the Mediterranean Sea into Lower Egypt in the north. Now, Upper Egypt is called upper because the land is elevated and closer to the source of the Nile. It's the highlands. Lower Egypt refers to the marshy swamps very close to the Mediterranean Sea. That's where the Nile actually flows into the Mediterranean. And the renowned author, J.E. Manship, wrote about this. Excuse me. He says, Egypt is the River Nile. On each side runs a narrow carpet of soil which supports a teeming population. Lower Egypt is short and broad. Upper Egypt is long and narrow. The two divisions, or two lands as ancient Egyptians called them, are complementary. The Egyptians referred to Upper and Lower Egypt as the two lands, and what they called it was Tawi. And Upper Egypt was symbolized by the lotus plant, and Lower Egypt was symbolized by the papyrus plant. Now, during the pre-dynastic period, before Egyptian history officially began, the two lands were politically at odds. The country was divided into two separated kingdoms. Again, Upper Egypt in the south, Lower Egypt in the north. The kings of Lower Egypt wore the so-called red crown. The kings of Upper Egypt wore the so-called white crown. Now, according to Egyptologists, there was a constant rivalry. There was a lot of fighting, a lot of political problems between the two kingdoms. And here, if you could see it, there's a doctrine of duality here. There's this kind of yin and yang kind of going at each other. And we call that yin and yang, and the Freemasons call that Jachin and Boaz, as we talked about yesterday. All that we're really missing from this two kingdoms dichotomy is a third power, a reconciling power. Remember, the middle door. Where's the middle door of the triptych? We're just seeing the two outer doors. Where's the middle? So around 3100 BC, King Narmer, who was supposedly the first king of dynastic Egypt, united the two lands. This is considered the single most important event in Egyptian history. It laid the foundation for an era that we call dynastic Egypt, which is the Egyptian history that essentially scholars study, Egyptologists study. So together, all the dynasties compose this dynastic Egypt. Professor R.T. Rundle Clark, who lectured at Birmingham University, said Egypt was a union of two distinct regions, the Delta in the north and the Nile Valley in the south, and the king was the reconciler of the two, the reconciler of the duality, the reconciler of the opposites. And that's a key here. Writing in the 1940s, Henri Frankfurt, who was a professor of pre-classical antiquity at the University of London, explained this concept of the unification of the two lands in a very important way. He said, expressed in political form the deeply rooted Egyptian tendency to understand the world as a series of pairs of contrast balanced in unchanging equilibrium. When Pharaoh assumed dualistic titles or called himself Lord of the Two Lands, he emphasized not the divided origin, but the universality of his power. The dualistic forms of Egyptian kingship embody the peculiarly Egyptian thought that a totality comprises opposites. The only place where he was wrong, in my opinion, is when he says the peculiarly Egyptian thought, because we find it in every ancient civilization. Just as I spoke about yesterday, the yin-yang, the concept of the circle being the uniter of the yin and the yang. The circle is the third power. And here the Egyptian pharaoh is the third power, holding both lands under his control. He's the lord of the two lands. It's very clear then that we can see here a very similar religion to ancient China. We see twin serpents adorning the Aton, wearing the white and red crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. It's clearly the same thing. It perfectly parallels the ancient Chinese Taijitu symbol showing the yin and the yang. The serpent of Upper Egypt wearing the white crown parallels yang. The serpent of Lower Egypt wearing the red crown parallels yin. And just as yin and yang are encompassed by that circle, the sun disk, or the circular Aten, balances the two lands. And so this is an extremely parallel religion. And this is a very important parallel and similarity that I've never seen in any kind of official books, scholarly books, texts, and that type of thing. Thus, we're speaking of metaphysical history when we're seeing these symbols, we're seeing symbols of ourselves, of who we are. And if you look at the actual yin-yang symbol, it almost looks like two serpents fighting each other. One with a white eye with a black body, and one with a black eye with a white body. And there's a parallel there as well. So duality exists inside the circle. The circle is the soul. So duality exists inside the soul. So you're not some helpless little puppet, as Alan Watts would say, being kicked around by omniscience. You are omniscience. And you have within you those twin puppets, okay? So that's the main teaching here. And this is what the immortal Persian poet and astronomer Omar Khayyam meant when he said, I sent my soul through the invisible, some letter of that afterlife to spell, and by my soul returned to me and answered, I myself am heaven and hell. And that's a powerful phrase, and I love that phrase because I think it matches everything that I've researched in my life so far. So when you awaken your third eye, remember we talked about the third eye of the Freemasons yesterday, then the middle eye, the eye that sees within. When you awaken your third eye, you recognize these metaphysical truths. And you begin to see that ancient cultures all around the world, like the Egyptians, based their entire civilization around these ideas. Now, when I was researching the third eye, I started to notice something strange in a lot of the third eye imagery that I saw from Egypt. I started to notice that when the Egyptians would depict their third eye with, two eyes and the sun disk as the third eye in the middle, remember from yesterday it was the Hindu bindi dot, the third eye chakra in the middle, the solar symbol in the middle. I noticed that they always put the same god under it, the same deity, standing in the same sitting or kneeling posture. Here's another image, very similar to that one. Now look closely at this posture, at this deity. Two eyes flank the Aten, which is in the position of the third eye, and directly beneath the Aten we see a goddess with outstretched arms, holding the twin Ankh crosses symmetrically in each hand. I deleted the wings here so you could see the outstretched arms. The Ankh cross symbolizes eternal life, or rather the spiritual life of the soul. And the third eye also symbolizes that kind of inner you, that higher self you, that spiritual, eternal third eye you. This same deity is visible in many of Egypt's third eye depictions. The more I looked, the more I found it. And I have literally hundreds of photographs that I could be plugging up here but sometimes less is more, so I just want to keep your eyes focused on these. I soon learned that this image of this deity holding twin objects in each hand actually has a name. The Egyptians knew about this deity. It has a name. It's called He, okay, H-E-H. It's called He. And Egyptologists have deciphered its meaning. You know what it means? Lord of Eternity. Isn't that special? Lord of Eternity. That's what He means. The hieroglyph He means eternity. It's a perfect fit, I thought. A perfect fit. No wonder it's always depicted with those images of the third eye. No wonder. It's perfect. When you awaken your third eye, you see the eternal within. So the Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge, more than 100 years ago, recognized this, saying that the god He stood for eternity, the eternal, endless or limitless eternity, forever and ever. He was often depicted as a deity holding twin palm branches, those are palm branches, in his hand. And so the god was often considered as androgynous, and that's another important thing. Look at both the long hair and the beard. Have you ever wondered why a lot of Egyptian pharaohs kind of have that long hair and beard? And I believe that the reason is because what they're doing is they're combining the genders. Usually we'd think of long hair associated with women, and usually we think of a beard associated with men. When you combine the two, you're creating a sort of an androgen, and that symbol has reached us in the occult and the Hermetic wisdom as being a symbol of the kind of center point between the opposites. Not male, not female, androgynous, neutral. And it doesn't have anything to do with your sexual orientation. It just has to do with your spiritual orientation. Now note the Ankh cross looped around the arm. Again, the Ankh is the symbol of eternity. So we know that this posture is a very spiritual posture. It's imitating the eternity of life, of the eternal life of the soul. So images of He are abundant in Egypt, and they're often crowned with the Aton symbol, even if the two eyes aren't there. Here we can see that there were not just the same old He deity, but lots of Egyptian deities were depicted in this kind of, in this form where they're holding twin objects symmetrically. And here we have an example of an Egyptian god. His name is Bes, B-E-S. Something cool is coming up right now, watch. This god's name is Bes. Now, when I started to look into this, I really was searching not just Egypt, I was looking at all of other cultures. And you know where I found something real parallel to this? Does anybody know what this is? Now, we're in the land of megaliths, right? And has anybody ever recognized the power of this symbol or linked this symbol to any of the megaliths? No. But it's in the land of the megaliths. Why? I don't know, but it's just like that, you know? It's just like that. It's the exact same thing. This is the Long Man of Wilmington, for those of you who don't know. And I spotted this many years ago, and it really pushed me forward to try to search for this Egyptian icon in other parts of the world. This is a colossal hill figure said to be one of England's most enduring mysteries. It measures a colossal 227 feet from top to bottom, and he's described as Europe's largest representation of the human form. The giant holds what appear to be two staves symmetrically in each hand, and he looks just like the god He from Egypt. And I started to realize that as I started to look around the world, I started to see this image more and more, and not just in one culture, but in all the cultures. And what I started to realize was there were a certain group of cultures that really always depicted it in their art and architecture. Those were the pyramid cultures. And those were the pyramid cultures that built Triptych Temples. So I really was turned on at this point because I knew I wasn't just seeing things. They're there. And it's just a matter of recognizing. And if you look at each culture also, there are important symbols in each culture. We'll see that now. I started to realize that in addition to the triptych, this other symbol that I would start to call the God Self icon also symbolized this kind of balance of opposites, and I'll explain that now. Here's another image of the God Self icon from all around the world, from cultures all around the world, including, but not limited to, Sumer, Bolivia, Nigeria, India, Greece, Persia, Indonesia, and so on. As I continued my research, I realized, as I said, the things in the hands are usually opposing each other. They stand for opposing principles, or the coincidentia oppositorum. Now, the God Self icon had supreme importance in some cultures, very obviously supreme importance in some cultures. And one of those cultures is actually not a culture, but a country now, it's Peru. Everywhere you go in Peru, you see the God Self icon, what I call the God Self icon. Andean archaeologists have noticed this. They've noticed that in Peru only, they've said, this symbol, this guy holding the twin staffs in each hand, they call it the staff god. And they say that this is the most important symbol probably in all of Peru. That's pretty big stuff, you know. What they haven't realized, though, is that the very same symbol that they call the staff god was widespread in the so-called Old World also, and on the other side of the planet. These images that you see here are from the Old World culture called Giroft, which was a small civilization in ancient Persia. It's dated to the late 3rd millennium BC. And they look very much like the staff god symbols of the Andes. And there's a very clear parallel there, facing forward, twin symmetrical objects held in each hand outward from the body, okay? So in my book, The Missing Link, I set forth the idea that the God Self icon, like the Triptych Temple, could possibly be evidence of a connection between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And possibly evidence of a mother culture, the way the Victorian era archaeologists believed in the possibility of a mother culture. I think this is strong evidence to their favor. So we get a sense of this possibility when looking at these God Self icons right here, which I'm about to show. This is the book that I actually published on the concept strictly of the God Self icon. It's called The Missing Link. It's an ebook. It's not available here. So look here. This, to me, is probably the most powerful evidence that I've found so far of a connection. The image on the left is from Bolivia, which is close to Peru. The image on the right is from Egypt. Now, the similarity here is really striking. The overall shape is a perfect match, and the details are amazing. Note the parallel hands, elbows, squat body, elongated staffs, and notice how they're held symmetrically. Here's a closer look. On the right, Egypt's master masons created this God Self. It's called Bes, as we described earlier. In the image on the left is from Tiahuanaco, a place called Tiahuanaco in Bolivia, and it's the so-called Viracocha deity, created by master masons in the Andes. Now, this image, these images show the possibility that the twin civilizations here, the two civilizations here, were working off the same blueprint. The visual parallel is honestly just the tip of the iceberg, because scholars tell us that the Egyptians and the ancient Andean cultures actually followed the same balance of opposites religion. And we can see that here. On the left, we have two God Self icons from Peru. On the right, we have two God Self icons from Egypt. Note how the two God Self icons on the bottom are holding a single serpent in each hand, while the two God Self icons on the top are holding two serpents in each hand. So there's an added detail to the parallel here. On the left side is Peru. We're told by scholars in the quote here, Andean sensibility stresses the synthetic joining or fusion of complementary or opposing entities, sometimes around a central point or entity. This matches exactly what we read on the right side, and we see in Egypt, the phenomenon of duality pervades Egyptian culture and is at the heart of the Egyptian concept of the universe itself. But rather than focusing on the essential differences between the two parts of a given pair, Egyptian thought may stress their complementary nature as a way of expressing the essential unity of existence through the alignment and harmonization of opposites. So by extending both hands outward from the body, the God Self icon is standing in between the duality. He's balancing the duality. Now, after noticing the God Self icon among ancient cultures, I started to look for it in Gothic cathedrals, and I found it plenty. And that, to me, is very interesting, because yesterday we talked about how the Freemasons created the Triptych Temple from ancient civilizations, how it was inherited from ancient civilizations. Seeing the God Self icon here in the Gothic cathedrals means it's another added symbol that's also inherited from ancient civilizations, and not just one ancient civilization, but multiple ancient cultures. To me, this marked evidence that the Freemasons really did inherit ancient wisdom from the past. And to me, this was kind of a reason to continue my research. The idea was to memorialize, again, what I called the ancient universal religion, the universal religion of the Triptych Temple. So I even noticed strange twists on the God Self icon, like this twin-tailed siren symbol, which we find in multiple ancient depictions of cathedrals. It's the same 3 in 1. The yins and yangs of the world we live in are symbolized by the 2 legs. And the siren herself embodies the eternal soul within. And variations of the God Self icon also exist. We can see that in this Gnostic symbol of Abraxas, with twin serpent legs facing the sun and moon. And we see that on the right and the left. Again, we talked about yesterday, the right being the solar, the left being the lunar. Notice the twin serpents parallel to Egypt, the Aton symbol, facing opposite directions. Another famous twist on the God Self icon is a figure known as the androgen, which we talked about earlier. This figure mysteriously appeared in an array of medieval alchemical manuscripts. It shows a being with 2 heads, one male, one female, holding in its outstretched arms a sun and a moon, the sun in the male right hand, a moon in the female left hand. This balance of opposites shows that the center is the most, it's almost a triptych. You could see the triptych. The body in the middle is the center door, and the twin opposites are the male and female. A Masonic version of this androgen is called the rebus. The rebus, his right hand is linked to the sun, and the left hand is linked to the moon. The rebus additionally holds a compass, a Masonic compass tool in the right hand, which is solar, and balanced by a square tool, a Masonic square tool in the left hand. Now focus on those for a second. The compass and square are the chief symbols of Freemasonry. And here's a quote from Ohio State University scholar Hugh Urban. He says, he described the rebus as the mystery of the balance or coincidence of opposites. This is the secret of universal equilibrium between good and evil, light and darkness. Male and female, sun and moon, light and dark, symbolized by the Masonic compass and square, all come from the same source. So going back, we see that these ancient symbols, these ancient symbols from different parts of the world, which stand for the balance of opposites, this coincidentio oppositorum, same thing as the triptych. We see them in Gothic architecture built by the Freemasons, and we see that is known in the symbol of the rebus, and we're even told by scholars that it symbolizes the balance of opposites. That's pretty big stuff, I think. I think it's very important. And it surprised me that, and the reason I wrote books on it is because nobody else has talked about this. This is not talked about by anyone. No one's found this. No one's seen this. And to me, it's very obvious and meaningful. So the rebus is depicted standing atop a dragon as if conquering the wild beast. Here the dragon symbolizes our ego, our lower base desires and appetites. Legend says that the rebus was the first human being, perfect and divine. Unlike us, the rebus was fully conscious of its own divine nature. The rebus knew its inner divinity and that it was different. The rebus knew that its inner divinity was different from its outer human shell. This gnosis made the rebus godlike. But then something happened and the rebus fell into becoming who we are today. To explain this fall, the ancient Gnostics, who were the forerunners of the Freemasons, told the story in which God created the rebus but became jealous that the rebus was like him, knowing his eternal godhood. For this reason, God divided the rebus into 2 sexes, 2 independent beings weaker than the original and imperfect. One sex became predominantly male, with emphasis on solar qualities like day, light, hot, fire, and dry. The other sex became predominantly female with emphasis on feminine qualities or lunar qualities like night, dark, cold, water, and wet. However, buried in their unconscious memory was a sense of their true essence and lost perfection, a vague memory of a past splendor when they were the rebus. It's for this reason that humans are attracted by love and marriage, always seeking to return to their primordial state of unity, divinity, and perfection. That's how the story goes anyway. The rebus lives at the center of every one of us. That's what the myth is trying to say, the story is trying to say. The rebus lives at the center of everyone. It's our God self. Again, center door of the triptych, balancing the sun and moon, balancing the square and compass. It's your divine spark. Like the Triptych Temple, this is one of the secrets of Freemasonry. As the primordial human, the rebus is neither male nor female. And we see this again, holding the square and compass. Let's talk about that for a second. By holding them in each hand, it's balancing them, as all opposites were balanced in the beginning. And here's something that I found even more interesting. It's not just these Masonic symbols encoded in architecture or encoded here as symbolism of Freemasonry. We also see it in alchemical manuscripts. This is a manuscript dated to the 1600s. It's the God Self icon, again, holding twin objects symmetrically, each hand, sun associated with the right, moon with the left. Here's an alchemical manuscript. It's the golden tripod, Michael Mayer, 1618, the god Mercury. He's holding a pair of caduceus symbols, a sun beneath one, a moon beneath the other. He's in the God Self icon pose. So this image here is from the 16th century alchemical book called The Rosary of the Philosophers, God Self icon in the form of a woman, actually. Same thing, sun, moon, right, left. And this esoteric design has an unknown origin. It seems to be saying the same thing. The inner king, the inner divine, the master, is found when the opposites are in balance. And here's another king or master. I apologize for the watermark. I couldn't actually find the photos without the watermark. The king or master, this is from Azoth, from the series Basil Valentine, 1613. Again, sun in the right hand, moon in the left. So the rebus is your God self. It existed in the beginning when all dualities in creation were balanced, still united, before the separation, before what some people might call the fall. And so in order for a human being to return to that source, to return to that pristine state, they have to balance the opposites or bring together the opposites in a kind of willful alchemy. And we do that by unifying the two. So notice how the compass and square are kind of separated from each other. They're pulled apart together. Now, that's not the usual case. Usually what we see is the square and compass together, as we do in Freemasonry, and we see that right here. Here they're pulled apart. Here they're together. Now, most Masons just don't know what this symbol means. Most people don't know what this symbol means. This is the Masonic square and compass symbol. The letter G has to do with geometry or God or gnosis, depending on who you ask. For me, I've always been fascinated by this symbol because I've always felt like I understood what it means. The higher self and the lower self, the spiritual self and the bodily or creature animal self. The higher self is symbolized by the compass on top. The lower self is symbolized by the square on the bottom. The compass and square symbolize, they're symbols of the makeup of every human being. This compass is a symbol of the soul, the square is a symbol of the body, and when they're placed together, they're actually a symbol of the body and the soul together, as we are when we're human beings. So if you look at the square, it's actually lower than the compass. The compass is higher, the square is lower. And that's because, according to this ancient thought, this esoteric thought, the soul is higher than the actual body. The body is lower because the body is an animal that lives and dies on earth, and it has an ego, and it has different kind of appetites and desires and that type of thing. Whereas the soul is pure, it's perfect, it's eternal, it's deity. So here, that's the reason why the compass is higher and the square is lower. There's another reason, too, because the square forms a square figure. And the number 4 is important because when the soul manifests into the world, it manifests into a world that's 4-sided. And we see that in the 4 cardinal points of the compass, in the 4 seasons, in the 4 elements, and in the 4 states of matter. The operative Freemasons have esoterically encoded the imagery of the square and the circle, or the compass and the square, by creating it by encoding it into different types of architecture. Now, in the Masonic square and compass symbol, the compass is, we talked about that, sorry. Okay, so let's see. In his 1922 book, this is all supported by author Demon Wagstaff. He said, there's one sign which has never changed its meaning in the civilized world, the compass and the square, a union of the body and the soul. I didn't find a lot of quotes about that. That's one that I did find that kind of backs up what I'm talking about, and that's why I included it. So it means essentially that, according to some of the ancient philosophers, our soul has descended so far into the material world that from our higher heavenly home, that we've forgotten our true selves. We have amnesia of who we really are. And these teachings are very important because as man, we've lost sight of the soul within, and that's the God within, the center point of the triptych, which is who we really are. We know we have a body, we know we have a square part. We see that in the mirror every day, but it's a little bit more difficult to see the spiritual part, the compass part, the circle part, because that's something that we can't really see or taste or touch. It's the higher soul, the God within us. To me, this is done through a kind of inner alchemy, and that's a whole different lecture. A lot of you have come up and asked me, how do you balance the opposites? And there's a lot of self-help books. There's a lot of books that talk about awakening the third eye, finding the soul within, balancing the opposites. This is really just about showing the archaeology of it, showing how it's not just an ancient Hindu teaching. You find it in China, you find it in Egypt, you find it in the Americas as well. So let's conclude today with an example of how you can do this, just in a kind of psychological way. And the way this is done, Hindus tell us, is just to think that everything is always changing. Everything is always kind of going back and forth from yin to yang to yin again. And in Freemasonry, this concept is symbolized by the checkerboard floor, the black and white checkerboard floor of Gothic cathedrals, castles, and other medieval architecture. Life is always changing from good to evil, evil to good, right to wrong, etc., back and forth. But the trick is to remember that what the Greek philosophers taught was that we're living in Plato's cave. The reality that we see is not really reality. It's a shadow of the reality. And as an example of this, we can look out into the world and we see that, for example, continents, they are not really always continents. They change their shapes. They shift. Rivers dry up and other rivers begin. The lives of plants and animals and humans are especially fleeting, they're temporary. Even in space, as we all know, stars, planets, and galaxies spin into and out of existence. Everything has a temporary stability, and so it appears like it's reality. But eventually everything changes. And so for the ancient Hindus and other cultures, this meant that everything is not really real, okay? Yin passes into yang, and yang passes into yin. And so this constant change meant for the ancients that life is more like a dream. And this I found everywhere in all cultures. They talked about this. And we have a memory of this concept here. The 13th century Persian poet Rumi said, this place is a dream. Only a sleeper considers it real. Then death comes like dawn, and you wake up laughing at what you thought was your grief. The 17th century poet and writer Pedro Calderón said, what is life? An illusion, a shadow, a story. All life is a dream. And René Descartes famously said, how can you be certain that your whole life is not a dream? And we find this in nursery rhymes too. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, merrily, 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 life is just a dream. Life is but a dream. And the immortal Shakespeare, we are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. So over the years, I've come to believe these life is a dream statements have profound significance. I think they're related to the God Self icon. I think they're related to the triptych as well. And the triptych and the God Self icon have taught me that, that there's a deity inside, and that the Christian religion has kind of pulled it out and thrown it over there and said, follow that guy. But really, it's inside you. It's inside every one of you. And all the architecture that you see, and all the myths that you hear, and all the religions all teach what's inside you. And we're at megalithomania, and all the megaliths that we see, and all of that doesn't have to do with anything out there. It has to do with you, and it's touching you, and it's up to you to make that connection. Because obviously scholars aren't making that connection for us. So the triptych and the God Self icon, I hope to do more research on them in the years to come, and hope to expand on the existing research. And I just want to take a second and say thank you to you all for listening to my lecture, and thank you to Hugh and the organizers of the conference for inviting me. Had a great time, and they've done a splendid job. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it.